All right, so welcome to Timothy's Tavern. I'm up here in the assembly room where the people of Ridgefield would come and enjoy some drinks with Timothy and Esther and discuss the goings on that are happening. There's a lot of exciting politics happening in 1775, excuse me. So the drink I'm going to be making today, our specialty drink, is called a stone fence, and it was a very popular tavern drink in the 18th century, and it uses two of the most popular beverages available at the time, rum and hard cider. So our drink is made of, we have some rum here, so I'll measure out some rum. And it's about 2 ounces of rum. And I'll pour that in my mug. And then I've got some hard cider, and hard cider was ubiquitous. Everybody basically had their own orchard on their farm, and they would press the apples for the juice, and then once you let it sit for a while, it ferments. And that's the best way to preserve apples. So everybody was drinking hard cider, even here in Ridgefield. So I'm going to top up my drink with some hard cider. And then the last thing I'm going to do is garnish my drink with a little bit of nutmeg. So nutmeg was very popular to garnish drinks. You find it in just about every colonial drink there is. And we are in the nutmeg state as well. So I'm gonna garnish with just a little bit of nutmeg. And there you have a stone fence. So I hope you all have your own drink, and I hope you enjoy. And a couple of things, I want to share a couple things about the stone fence. And one of the reasons I chose this particular drink, besides its popularity among colonial tavern goers, was that it played a role in the Revolution. Early on, a couple of years before the Battle of Ridgefield, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys were up in Vermont, and they decide that they are going to go and recapture the fort at Ticonderoga. And so they head over to Ticonderoga to Lake Champlain, and they're spending the night at a tavern called Remington's Tavern in Burlington, Vermont, the night before their planned raid. And they have, they're spending the night, so they're going to celebrate and get ready and get hyped up for this raid they're going to do. And one of the things that they drink a lot of was the stone fence. And it's believed, we're not certain, but it's believed that Benedict Arnold also joined the Green Mountain Boys at Remington's Tavern. And we do know Benedict Arnold, a few years later, would come here to Ridgefield as well. So I am going to show a couple of little images. So here we have Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys in council. This etching is from the 1800s, 1850s, I think. So, but here they are at a tavern, possibly drinking some stone fences and planning their raid on Ticonderoga. And the origin of this name, Stone Fence, we're not exactly sure where it came from, but it's possibly because the effect of having one too many of these drinks is like running into one of the ubiquitous New England stone fences. So they are pretty strong. So here we have our Green Mountain Boys at Remington's Tavern. And as I mentioned, the hard cider was ubiquitous in the 13 colonies. And every town would have at least one cider mill. So here we have, this is a Currier and Ives print of a New England cider mill. But Ridgefield had at least three that I'm aware of. There's one up in Ridgebury, which was owned by a cousin of Timothy Keeler. His name was Isaac Keeler, and his mill, it was a cider mill and grist mill, and that was burned by the British during the Battle of Ridgefield. But there's that mill, and then there was also another cider mill down right along Route 7 that was also owned by a Keeler. And so some of the Keeler cousins did own mills, and they probably looked very similar to this image here. And among our archives, we do have a number of Timothy Keeler's ledgers from his store. And you can see here, we have Gamaliel Northrup, who is on one side here on the left side of the screen. You can see he's purchasing a lot of rum from Timothy Keeler. You know, every couple of days he's coming back for another gallon, another quart. And that's most of what Timothy is actually selling in his store is rum. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this is what Gamaliel Northrup is offering to Timothy to barter for his rum. And you can see highlighted here, he's actually making cider for Timothy Keeler as a way to pay off some of his debt from purchasing all of this rum. So even just looking through these ledger books, you can see we have all of the ingredients needed for a stone fence coming through Timothy Keeler's store. So I thought that would be very interesting to show everybody here. So that's pretty much all I have. I hope you enjoy your stone fence, and you know, hopefully tomorrow we won't need to go raid any forts, but
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. That's great. So I just put in the chat, if you have any questions. Catherine and I are both monitoring the chat. We'll open it up a little later towards the end, but right now, if you have anything you'd like to ask, just, you know, add it to the chat. Great. Okay, so now Sharon, you're up next. So you need to unmute yourself, Sharon.
Muted.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I think it's really exciting that the town of Ridgefield was honored to get a National Park Service grant for the Battle of Ridgefield. They're few and far between. It's a national grant, and Ridgefield was the first Revolutionary War battlefield grant in Connecticut for the American Park Service Battlefield Protection Program. So I think we should feel honored that the National Park Service saw us as an important event in American history. The heightened interest in the Battle of Ridgefield probably started with the discovery of the skeletons on Main Street, and near the main engagement. And I think that you know, that added to the application we made for the you know, for the grant, and helped us to get it. But anyway, the main archaeologist at the dig was Dr. Nick Bellantoni, and we have a short video to play for him. It's just 7 minutes about the dig with the skeletons, and I think you'll find this all very interesting. What year was the discovery? It was asked. Actually, I believe it was November 2019 when the first skeleton was found. And then additional skeletons were found, I think, through July. Not through July, through January of 20.
Okay, here we go.
all right.
A grant from the National Park Service to conduct not only further historical research on the battle, but to conduct archaeological surveys and working to uncover more evidences throughout the village area to help us understand better what happened. This is very exciting. They don't give too many of these out. And so for them to have received this grant is extraordinary. And hopefully we'll be working with the Historical Society in the coming year with their consulting archaeologist involved. The medical examiner went down to the site and excavated the first burial, one we would call burial 3, but it was the first one excavated by the medical examiner's office. The question became, was this an individual, a fallen soldier from the Battle of Ridgefield? Well, forensically, we do have some information about this individual. It's an adult male, 25 to 45 years of age. It's estimated the height based on long bones to be about 5 feet 11, which is a pretty good size back then by the late 18th century. However, there was no sign of trauma and there were no associated artifacts. So when we came on board, a second burial had been uncovered. And this was about 15 feet south of the first burial. And the way this individual lays out was in an east-west orientation, head to the west. So one of my thoughts was that this could be a burial ground because of the fact that Christian burials in the historic period were laid out in an east-west orientation, head to the west. And the idea was on the day of resurrection, Christ would come up with the sun out of the east and draw you from your housing, and you would join in the resurrection. So you laid with your head to the west, so as you faced the east, laying in the grave. So this is consistent with burial practices. And so at this point, I couldn't deny that these might be just a burial, a farmer family burial in the back, what was then the backyard. And this was quite common. In New England, especially in Connecticut, many farmers did bury their dead on their properties, and many of them have lost their wooden crosses, or in some cases field stones, and so many have been uncovered due to construction projects in the past. So at this point, I couldn't find any evidence for our hypothesis of Ridgefield battle burials. So we had two hypotheses when we started the work: Revolutionary War burials or family burying ground. And again, in my slide, extremely cooperative property owners who supported us in every way they possibly could. We were assisted by UConn anthropology graduate students and volunteers from the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology and the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. So we had great support system. It was a very difficult excavation in terms of the tightness of the area, but also because of the soils. The soils themselves, it was very clayish. Usually we see burials in sandy soil, glacial till, but in this case, there was a lot of clay. So it was very hard packed, and you had brittle skeletal remains in a hard packed matrix of soil. Made the excavation extremely difficult to preserve everything we needed to preserve in terms of these individuals, and took much longer than I had anticipated. But then a third burial was uncovered, laying right next to the second burial. So over here is the second burial we found, and then this new individual is the third burial. And what we saw right away is that the two of them were commingled. That is to say, they weren't just laid out separately, they were overlapping each other. And this individual, number two that we saw first, we could see that his shoulder, his right shoulder, was up higher than the rest of the skeletal remains, which was kind of almost a shrugged appearance. And the end of the feature was right there. So these guys were put in haphazardly, quickly, overlapping each other. And so it started to no longer look like a family burying ground. So here's a little bit better of a schematic of what I'm talking about. You can see the two individuals with their arms kind of intertwined from each other. They're both heads are to their right. facing down. They are laid in a Christian pattern, but clearly they are now commingled in a common grave. And then we found a fourth, and you could see just here underneath the house foundation, we started coming up with another individual. And also notice on number 2 here that number 2 has a series of buttons coming down the main, the chest area of the individual, as well as buttons now showing up with the 4. So now we have 4 burials, 3 of which are in a common grave. The earlier one that was found by the medical examiner's office was about 15 feet away and clearly not a part of this grave. But we had 3 individuals now in a mass grave. And forensically, though we were just doing this in terms of observations made in the field, not in the laboratory, and I'll talk about that in a moment, what we could see in the field was that all 4 of these individuals were adult men, very robust, very thick boned. Okay. I often tell people, you know, what you eat and what you do with your body gets recorded on your skeleton. And these guys were very robust. You could see the bone density. You could see the tuberosities where the muscles attach are large. So these are all men, and they're all very robust individuals.
So, you know, I think Nick is very interesting in the video. And I think it's appropriate that we start out with him because he's the one that actually recommended we apply for a National Park Service grant, and also that we partner with SHPO, the State Office of Historic Preservation. And he was very helpful in trying to obtain that. So what I'd like to do is just give you a little overview of the grant and what the researchers are doing and some possible new findings. So
there we go.
Right. Okay. So this is the Battle of Ridgefield Research and Long-Term Stewardship Grant. That's the formal title of it. It was supported by the U.S. Department. It is supported by the U.S. Department of the Interior, the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. And if you want more information about American Battlefield Protection Program grants, you could log on to the National Park Service website. The next slide, please. Okay, just a brief grant overview. So the Historical Society was awarded a 2-year grant. It was approximately $50,000 for this project. It began in September 2020, and it's in partnership with the State Office of Historic Preservation. The grant provides seed funding to research the Revolutionary Battle of Ridgefield and to encourage community input in future stewardship priorities. The Ridgefield Historical Society envisions this as being the first in a series of grants. Other grants may focus on additional historical research, archaeology research. The award of the Battle of Ridgefield site is a historic designation, and also an educational component, which will be great to get Keeler involved in. Okay, the next one, next slide. Okay, so we set out for 5 tasks for the grant, and the first one was to form a battleship advisory group, and this was set out actually in our grant application. They oversee the grant. It meets 4 times a year, includes the state historian, the state archaeologist, Rooney Marconi, the first selectman, Dan O'Brien, chairman of the Historic District Commission, representatives from the State Office of Historic Preservation, a liaison to the governor, Kay Abels, who's here tonight, and our town historian and author, Keith Jones. So that's the advisory group. The first task we had was to hire consultants to do the research. We hired heritage consultants. The main principals in that consulting firm are Dr. Kevin McBride. He's an archaeologist. He's a University of Connecticut professor. and Dr. David Numack. He's a military historian. He's also a professor. And David George, who's a geographic information system specialist, global positioning system specialist, and ground penetrating radar specialist. So those are the three people primarily working on the grant. The task that they are doing, in which they're really involved in doing now, is identifying the extent of the battle based on primary and secondary source material. And I want to thank Keeler Tavern, because one of the first stops in investigating the battle, of course, was to go over to Keeler, and their archivist and everybody was very helpful in telling us any documents they had or information about the Battle of Ridgefield or artifacts. And it really helped add to our database, because we're doing a master database of all the information we can find on the Battle of Ridgefield. What we're going to do at the end is the researchers will be doing an inventory of all the artifacts attributed to the battle, and they're going to develop a final report. And also, I just want to say that part of this identifying primary and secondary sources, it's really important that the community, and I mean you people present, help us, because there are a lot of artifacts from the battle and a lot of stories that have been passed on about the battle. And I think it's very important that our community tell us of anything they know that's available, any stories that you add, contact us and add anything to our database, because that's the best way we're going to, get a good outcome from this. The fourth task is the battlefield integrity assessment and property owner outreach. The researchers are going to conduct a visual survey of the battle extent and create an assessment of the integrity of the core engagement areas. They're going to map the battlefield area, identify certain places there were skirmishes, etc. And property owners that retain the greatest potential for future survey investigations will be contacted to initiate consultation about their land and the significant role it played in our nation's history. So this is really, it's our community that they're investigating. Next, please. Tax 5 is going to be a public outreach engagement. I think this is really important, that the National Park Service recognizes that these grants are not going to be successful unless the community buys in to the importance of the battle. And they have actually given us money to hire a facilitator to work with the town and the community. And there'll be a series of educational meetings for the community about the battlefield, research, and also planning meetings. And how should we handle all this known knowledge? Should we have different educational programs run by Keeler? Should we have a national historic designation? There's a lot of ways the community could go, and hopefully we'll work together as a team and try to figure out what's the best way to use this knowledge we've gained about the Battle of Ridgefield. For updates, you can check this Historical Society website. If you have any information on the project, or you'd like to volunteer, hey, we're doing a lot of work in the background here. We'd love to have additional volunteers. I reached out to David Numack today and asked him what the any new avenues of research that are happening. And this is what David sent me an email earlier. And he said, what they've found so far is new British historical newspaper research, new details regarding casualties, brigade formations, and a few accounts of combat, which I think is very interesting. They're working with residents and others in the area to identify any artifacts that might be related to the battle. And he wanted me to tell you, the audience here today, that over the years, people have dug up cannonballs while working in their yards, as well as musket balls, buttons, and buckles. Although many of these artifacts have been lost over the years, simply knowing what they were and where they were found is helpful in reconstructing the battlefield events, as well as the arms and equipment used on both sides. So please, and one project the volunteers at the Ridgefield Historical Society are helping with is studying and mapping out these items on a Ridgefield map of where they exactly were found so that they can reconstruct the battle action. So anyone who has any stories or items, I know Keeler said, Kildy, you said often people come over to you with cannonballs. Please save all that information. That's really valuable. And I know David Numek has contacted you, and within the next week or two is going to be over there. So anyway, the other couple of things is they've identified a lot of archives in the Connecticut Archives Revolutionary War records up in Hartford that may be useful for us. They're going to give us copies to have locally. And also the Ridgefield Historical Society is building a 1777 Battle of Ridgefield research archive to store all the research material compiled during the course of this grant. It's going to be available to the public, and I hopefully a great benefit to researchers in the future. So I guess that's before, huh?
Great, that's wonderful. I know, that's very exciting.
Yes,
Thank you, Sharon.
It's a community project, and I think we should all work together. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Very, very exciting. And as I said, if you have questions, just put them in the chat and then we'll bring Sharon back on. So next up is Timothy. Timothy, you need to unmute yourself. And so this is George Hancock. Many of you know him. He's one of our illustrious docents, and he will tell you all about what happened on that fateful day of April 27th, 1777. Take it away, Timothy.
244 years ago? Boy, I've been around a long time. I was born in 1748, and here I am again. I want to first of all thank Keeler Tavern Museum for pulling me out of Titticus Cemetery, which they now call Maple Shade. It's tough being underground, but it's good that every once in a while I get to come out and talk to folks. I also like to say that the Graveyard Committee, Ridgefield Town Graveyard Committee, did a good job of cleaning up our whole cemetery this last Saturday. And they're looking forward and discussing where to put these new bones that we expect to get sometime next year back from the state. So that's going to be an exciting thing to rebury these folks, but in our old town cemetery. I also like to say that I represent an organization in here called RAGU, and I know that sounds like a funny name, but it's the Ridgefield Area Ghost Union. And we have just signed a contract with the Keeler Tavern Museum just in the last week. And we're going to be back out a lot of ghosts from Ridgefield, October, I think it's 28th, 29th, and 30th. So that would be about 6 months from tomorrow it'll start. And make sure you come to the Keeler Tavern Museum and see all the ghosts of Ridgefield. Okay, so that's the thank you and to get going here. I was asked to talk about the events of April 27th in Ridgefield, but really it's what's important is how we got there, kinda, and what the feelings were of the people in town, maybe to see it through those eyes. So I looked through the eyes of my wife, Esther, and my recollections. We also talked about Uncle David Hoyt, our next door neighbor, who is my mom's brother. And he was the guy that sold me the tavern back in 1769. We opened in 1772. So Uncle David is next door. He's a Tory, so I want to hear what he has to say. There's a woman down the middle of town on Main Street that owns a stable. Her name is Suzanne Lockwood. And when her father died, he made her, which was quite unusual at the time, the beneficiary of the stable that he owned. She had 3 younger brothers, but they didn't have the sense that God gave a rock. And I think old man Lockwood understood that and said, Suzanne is not only the fairest looking girl in town, but probably one of the smartest. And so she became the head of the stables. So we're going to talk about her a little bit, not too much. She was, when her father died, she said took over. The talk around town was that she was the stableman's only daughter, but all the horse manure. I can never turn down a good manure joke. So I had to share that one with you. Another person we're going to talk about is Old Man Stebbins. Old Man Stebbins lives at the place where the battle is going to happen. He's the last house on the right-hand side as you're going north down Main Street before you turn on John Copp's Hill. And he had 4 sons. So we had something to think about with him. Okay, so let's think about this, about how we found out about this. It wasn't really until Friday, April 25th, around dinner time, that we even heard that there had been some kind of invasion. We understood that the British had landed at Fairfield, on a place that was called Peach Bluff, now called Campo Beach, and now Westport. Westport wasn't a town way back then in those days, it was Fairfield. And so they landed and they came ashore, and we got a report that they were heading north up toward Weston. And that's where they ended up spending the first night. But all we knew at that point on Friday was that there was a parcel of British here and they meant business. We didn't know what their goals were, and we certainly worried. So the feeling around town was, holy mackerels, what's happening? Confusion about what the British were going to do, and some apprehension. Do you think they're going to burn our town down? That was a big deal. And might they even show up here? We didn't know. So that was on Friday. On Friday night, we understood that they were definitely going to go to Danbury. And they did that on Saturday morning. They took off Saturday morning around, I guess, around 7 or 8 o'clock, went through Bethel around 10, and at noon ended up in Danbury. And then reports started coming to us that there was not only some looting going on, but the British were trying to destroy any supplies that they could find that the Patriots had set aside. They had also there was a shot fired, and nobody knows who shot it, but there were 4 Patriots in a house, and the British surrounded that house and set it afire. General Tryon of the British was a guy that was noted for burning people, and that was something that was a flaw, of course, in his character that we'll never forgive. But so the British did their best up in Danbury to loot and raid. And we understood that there was a fire, and people were starting to worry that the British might end up coming to Ridgefield, and they might torch our town too. This was real. Before this time, before the British were in Danbury, it was a more innocent time. There were Tories and there were Patriots, but we were at least somewhat civil to each other. When the British set foot on our soil, it became way too real. And this was what I think the foreboding. Another one of the characters I would think about would be Reverend Jonathan Ingersoll, who was the minister of the Congregational Church. And all he would say was, the Lord will keep us and will shelter us from any harm. I can't imagine that these soldiers would do any harm to the civilians in our town. He was very reassuring in that way. There was not a minister of St. Stephen's, I don't recall at that time. I think on July of 1776, when we declared our independence, the Church of England cut off ministers, and we didn't have one. I don't recall that that's exactly the reason why, but that's around the time, July of 1776, that we stopped having a St. Stephen's minister for some 10 years after that. Okay, so we were there Saturday. The British have, in the afternoon, they've taken all these supplies. Salt pork was one of the things that they set fire to in the streets, which I understand was a terrible thing. The smell of that for weeks afterwards was a terrible thing up in Danbury. But they found around 5 or 6 o'clock, the British did, a supply of rum. And instead of pulling that out into the street and burning it, they decided that they were going to take that supply out one cup at a time. And by 6 or 7 o'clock, General Tryon was aware of what happened and was very worried because he had about half of his troops, almost 1,000 men, that were stone drunk. I wonder if they had stone walls that night. They may have, because they sure had the rum to make the drink. And he was worried about the fitness of his troops to fight. And so the next morning, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, he got those guys out and moving. So now we have 2,000 British troops heading toward Ridgefield. Half of them are very, very hungover and not feeling their best. And they're going to walk about 10 miles and then go into a battle. So this is not going to be a good day for the British troops. Riders have come down to Ridgefield to warn us. Now let's go back and that the British are coming. So let's go back over now and think about some of these guys. Reverend Ingersoll is now a little concerned that the British are going to come down here, and what's he going to say to those British when they get here? Mr. Stebbins got 4 sons. We talked about that. 3 of his sons are going to fight with the Patriots, but his oldest son, Josiah, decides that he, as a Tory, as a good Tory, is going to go to Danbury, and he's going to guide General Tryon back to Ridgefield. Boy, this is going to be trouble in the Stebbins family. Hey, while I'm here talking about Stebbins for a second, when Stebbins' family sold that house, they sold that property to a guy named George M. Alcott, GMO, his initials. And he decided that he would put a mansion up there, tore down the old Stebbins house, which had been there for 100 years. And then he decided that he would put the name on it, Casa GMO, Casagmo. So for the 3 people that don't know the story, he named it the Casa, Italian or Spanish for Casa, and GMO, his initials. And so he called the place Casagmo. All right, so he had an idea about that. I won't hold that against him, but I will hold this against him. He decided also at the time that there were about 200 feet of lilac bushes that went along that whole side of Main Street along the Stebbins property. And in times around the first week of May, for 50 years, people would come through town and just drive by those bushes in the 10 days or 2 weeks that they were blooming, just to smell and to see that whole thing. Well, George M. Alcott decided he didn't like the lilac bushes, and he tore them all out. And now we have a wall, the stone wall that we all know that goes along Main Street on that south side. He put that in. That was probably around 1910 or 1912. I don't know exactly. Now, when he died, George M. Alcott, his daughter, Mary, decided that she would put a stone on the side of the property along Main Street commemorating this battle of April 27th, 1777. Of course, when you put something in stone, you probably should get it right the first time. And this time it didn't happen. In the first line, it talks about how the British invaded Ridgefield on April 27th, 1877. And so now for 120 years, we've been stuck with a typographic error on our famous monument that commemorates the battle. All right, that's enough of the Alcotts. So now the British are on their way down here. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the pace in town is just completely frantic. The Tories are busy cleaning their porches, hoping that they're going to entertain British soldiers that night. And the Patriots are deciding what to do. They're spoiling for a battle. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Benedict Arnold shows up. Colonel Arnold, subordinate to General Worcester. And he also has the general from Fairfield, Gold Silliman. I always love that first name, Gold. And Gold Silliman had a couple of hundred men, and they started to converge on Ridgefield. Decided that they knew that there was a battle coming. Arnold told all the men with children and wives to get out of town and let the soldiers do the fighting. And so that's one of the reasons very few guys from Ridgefield actually participated in the Battle of Ridgefield. He decided that we should build a barricade at the end of the street to try to divert the British, keep them away from the town. didn't know really how many British there were. And I think that was the thing, to build a barricades with plows and wagons and firewood and anything else you could throw in there was maybe the wrong thing that we should have done. But anyhow, they did that. They decided they would defend it and they'd stand behind it. Benedict Arnold on his horse is there ready to defend. And he's got these men that have come over from Bethel, and they're all here with spoiling for a fight. Maybe a couple, 300 guys behind this barricade. Well, what was kind of demoralizing was to hear the British fifes and drums coming down North Salem Road. And we had heard some gunfire way up to the north, and that's where Worcester was actually mortally wounded up there and brought back to Danbury before they reached the town. But soon around the corner came the first of the British legions, and it was just a scary thing to see. I had an idea that I would stay and fight, but Esther had a little different idea, and she took me by the ear and said, "Timothy, you are not going to the barricade. You're going to take me and our kids out of here." We had David, who was 4 years old, and my daughter, Esther, was just 1 year old. So I had to take my wife out. But what I've heard from the battle is that it lasted about 15 minutes, and the British came right through our barricade. They attacked first straight on, and then the second attack was on all sides, on three sides at least. And there's no way that the men could stay there under that fire. Arnold was very, very good. And I say that now knowing what his history is going to be later on, but he was good at that moment. And he stood his ground, and he was on his horse, and he rallied the men to fight one more round. Just then a couple of musket balls hit his horse, and he was jumped from his horse as it fell. And soon after that, the action got so close that he was forced to jump off into the woods, and everybody else behind the barricade was forced to scatter. The British came down and commandeered downtown and got ready to start shooting some cannonballs down toward Timothy Keeler's Inn. Now, this would be a place that I'm quite familiar and loving, and had been there planning with the guys and had worked. We had our assembly room upstairs in the tavern, and we got to meet up there and talk about how we were going to beat the British and open up a tin of whoop ass on them when they came to town. But it didn't quite happen that way. It was more the other way. But we got settled in. The British started shooting cannonballs down toward the house. They heard that that's where the Patriots met. And General Tryon's quote to somebody was, "Let's see if we can't shake some of those Patriots out of the tavern." Well, they shook us up pretty good. And evidently, a cannonball, when it hits your house at a couple of 100 miles an hour, makes quite a racket. Who would have thought? But it sure did. And so there was one that's embedded in our wall that's still there today. And there were a couple of Patriots upstairs looking at the British. I wasn't there. I wish I had been. And they were watching to see the British advance down Main Street. One of them went down to see where one of the cannonballs had hit, because it made a racket when it hit. Couldn't find it. It was stuck in a corner post of the house. Didn't know it at the time. And soon after, the British came through, and those boys had to get out of there. They took off down toward Wilton, which wasn't a town yet. Ridgefield, when I was a boy, went from Danbury all the way to Norwalk. Wilton came in sometime in the 1800s, I believe. In any case, there were the British commandeering Main Street. 15 minutes through the battle, had the place pretty much to themselves. And what they did was they were tired. They had been through a 10-mile walk, as I said. They had been through a battle. Half of them were still inebriated from the night before, from all those stone fences. And so they pretty much had their dinner and slept for the night. Now, the next morning, that's Monday morning, April 28th, they got up early and they started heading south. Now, a lot of the people in town had taken their prized horses and their cows and had hidden in different parts of the town in the woods, hoping that the British weren't going to steal their stuff. We had already alluded to the fact that up in Ridgebury, a Keeler cider mill had been burned and confiscated. On the way down, one of Seth Keeler's cows was taken, and that was dinner for the British that night. And so people were very worried about their supplies. People with fine silver buried their silver in the backyard, or found places in a hollow tree, or took their animals to the woods and hid them. It was a mess. And so the British commandeered town. They left that next morning. And one of the things that happened on their way out of town was that we had Abigail Olmsted, waving her red petticoat at the British so that they wouldn't burn her house. Well, they didn't burn anybody out in town, and they pretty much left. Later on that day, I came back to town, knew the British were gone, and I'm walking around the house and I'm looking at the damage. There was some fire because the British had set fire to the house. Uncle David Hoyt, my neighbor, had gotten permission to put the fire out because it looked like it was going to catch onto his house too. If it hadn't, he might have let the tavern burn down. But in any case, he stopped that, stopped it from burning. And he came over when he saw me walking around. And he said to me, Timothy, I want you to know that a Tory has saved your house this day. And my response to him was, Uncle David, I will thank God, I will thank the north wind, but I will never thank a Tory for anything. Fortunately, Uncle David came over to the Patriot side later on in the war. And he was allowed to stay in town after the war was over. People that were notorious Tories, boy, try to say that 5 times fast, were not allowed to stay, and they went elsewhere. That's basically what happened that day. It was confusion. It was scared. It was never the same between the Tories and the Patriots after the British set foot on our soil. And it was a serious thing. Not so much fun to remember now, going way back when.
Thank you, Timothy. That was a wonderful retelling of the events, and it's wonderful how you always provide. I've heard you, Timothy George, tell the story many times, and every time there's something new to learn. So thank you for this wonderful recollection. And you brought up your neighbor, Uncle Benjamin Hoyt. So let's throw it to Doug Haynes. Doug, where are you?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great, wonderful. So, yes, so chime in.
Well, I know we're nearly at the bottom of the hour. The good news for everybody on the call is that I can speak a lot more concisely than I write. So I'm sharing a little bit about both our home, which is now the Fountain Inn next door to Keeler Tavern, and about a book that I wrote in 2018 called Gunpowder. Gunpowder begins actually the day before the Battle of Ridgefield down on the Saugatuck River. Isaiah Crane, a major in the Continental Army, pauses there as he races from the coast ahead of General Worcester and the King's Army coming up from the shore of Long Island. The book Gunpowder continues with Sybil Luddington's ride through the night, the skirmishes in Ridgebury and Ridgefield on the following day, where General Worcester was killed and Benedict Arnold was injured. If you've seen the book in Keeler Tavern, I've got a copy of it here. You can tell that it must have more than that battle in it because it's about 760 pages long. I won't spoil any of the surprises in there for anybody who is bold enough to go by Keeler Tavern, pick up a copy and tackle a book this big. But I will share that the story goes on through the rest of the Revolution. It winds up including the Siege of Charleston, which is still the largest capture of US troops in the country's history. 5,500 troops were captured in one battle. The book continues through Britain's challenge to the sovereignty of the United States in the War of 1812. And it finally wraps up intersecting one of our country's most well-known legends in a sleepy little farming community on the Hudson River. I'll give a little bit of background on the book and on our relationship with Keeler Tavern. My wife Loris and I moved to Ridgefield in 1998, and we took on the passion project of restoring the David Hoyt House, which is just one door south of Keeler. From literally the very first day, we were surrounded by Ridgefield's history, all the stories of the battle, the history of our home, including the story that Timothy just shared. And we did lots and lots of research on the architecture of the time in the colonies, the state, and the whole Housatonic River Valley. In 2018, after we had moved away from Ridgefield, I had to move when our kids graduated. One of the youngest of our children graduated from high school. I needed to move closer to New York City because my work had taken me to where I was going in and out of the city every day. I felt very lonely for being surrounded by history, and I decided that I would spend an hour every morning learning more about American history. All the things that I've been taught when I was in school and the things I learned about Ridgefield started to come together. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to understand it better and be part of it. So I started writing Gunpowder without really thinking about what I was doing and what it would take. And if I had known the hours of research, writing, and editing that were going to follow, I probably wouldn't have taken on at all. But it became a wonderful project with my father, my mother, my wife, and all of our children getting involved. I self-published Gunpowder, and I give with the idea that I would originally just give copies to families and friends, but it's become pretty popular. So now it's for sale at Keeler Tavern. And when we open the Fountain Inn on May 1st, it'll be for sale there too. So if you're intrigued and you want to read about it, or you want to read the book, please swing by Keeler or swing by the Fountain Inn once we're opened, and you can get a copy. And then, as I've just mentioned, Loris and I are opening the Fountain Inn on May 1st. Just to share a little bit about the house, it's sort of like writing the book Gunpowder. If I had known what it was going to take, I'm not sure we would have taken it on in the first place. The restoration of the home took us 10 years. We really loved the house. We loved being in Ridgefield, and we feel like the house in Ridgefield really loved us back. There could not have been a better place to raise our 5 children. We think of the Fountain Inn as a gift to Ridgefield, and we hope that it makes it possible for more people to come visit our town and get immersed in our history and all the other things that make Ridgefield so special. So there's my 5 minutes. Thanks for inviting me to join. Please do come see us at the Fountain Inn, and if you're intrigued, please do pick up a copy of Gunpowder. I promise it is not a boring book.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I have personally not had the time yet to read the full book, but it's definitely on my list. And also, we're very excited to have the Fountain Inn, open up on May 1st. It's just around the corner. And we have great plans for these wonderful events where, you spend the night in your wonderful B&B, and then the festivities, the parties, you just slip across and come to the garden house or the walled garden and continue the celebration. So thank you so much for being here. So I know that we're like a couple of minutes past the hour, but I would like to give a shout out to Terry Rose. Terry, you were here somewhere, right? So Terry was wonderful in that she actually researched and put together the history trivia contest that I hope a lot of you have been doing in April. Last year, we put the history trivia contest online because of COVID. And Terry volunteered to do all the research. So this year it's about the Civil War. We're honoring Charlie Pankenier. He was our quiz master par excellence. He did it for many years. And I just want to give Terry a quick shout out. There you are, Terry. Yeah, Terry Rose. So thank you for doing that. So let me see if we have any questions. If you have any question, you can also unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. I don't really see anything. Paula, are you asking? Okay, great. Okay, well, in that case, I would like to say thank you to Catherine for the stone fence. It was a lot of fun, as always, having you broadcast from the assembly room. Thank you to Sharon for sharing all this wonderful research and the exciting news about the grant. with the Ridgefield Historic Society. So there's a lot more to come, we know, so that's really wonderful. And Timothy, George, wonderful to have you here. It's great seeing you here. And Doug too, nice having you and Loris. We miss having you next door, but it's nice that we can reestablish the relationship and grow it from here. So to everyone, thank you so much for attending. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully by now you've finished your stone fence or poured yourself a second one. And we hope to see you soon. Have a good night, everyone.